He slept in a tent made of garbage bags and begged for food, but was jailed for stealing bread. No one asked who he was. Medals hung on his chest, but everyone looked away. A veteran forgotten by his country. Freezing on the streets, stomach empty, his service papers still in his pocket. They treated him like a criminal. Unjust, or just? If it feels wrong to you, write down your opinion in the comments. Before the winters were cruel, before the silence crept in, Staff Sergeant Walter Mercer was a man built from rhythm and fire. He led squads through terrain so cold it cracked the skin and silenced even the bravest voices. Walt never flinched. His men used to say he had steel running through his veins, but in truth, it was duty. The photos from that time show a younger Walt, face smudged with dust, eyes steady under a battered helmet. Always standing just behind Captain Ray Hollis, his commanding officer and closest friend. The two had bled together, laughed under mortar fire, and cried quietly when another letter from home came with bad news. They were family in a way only war makes possible. The most brutal deployment was winter in the mountains. Snow up to the knees. Enemy fire from cliffs. One night, under a full moon that made shadows dance, Walt had dragged Ray through a minefield after a roadside blast. Ray's lungs were failing, his leg mangled. Walt refused to leave him. Later, when Walt received the Bronze Star, he didn't attend the ceremony. He was busy filling out paperwork for the younger men, making sure they had homes, jobs, medical forms in order. Papers heavier than ammo, he used to mutter. When he finally came home for good, it was quiet. No parades. No welcome committee. Just a half-used Metro card, a folded flag, and a letter telling him to apply online for veterans' benefits. Susan, his wife of 32 years, had waited. She had grown thin, tired of hospitals and promises. Cancer doesn't pause for government backlogs. She passed 3 weeks after he returned. Her absence cracked something in him deeper than any bullet wound ever had. She had been the voice at the other end of every call. The sender of every care package. The keeper of normalcy. He buried her in the cemetery outside their hometown, beside her parents. He wore his uniform, even though it barely fit. After the ceremony, he folded her blanket and left it in her rocking chair. Then he walked out and never returned to that house again. At first, he tried to rebuild. He filled out forms, visited the local VA office. They said his files were in process. One clerk said his name wasn't in the system, must have been a clerical mix-up. She smiled, but he saw her eyes skip past his medals like they were counterfeit. He carried with him a brown envelope, creased and stained, full of discharge papers, deployment logs, and photocopies of medals. Still, the hospital refused to treat his frostbitten fingers. Not enough verified documentation. That's what they told him. A volunteer nurse had pulled him aside once, whispering, "This is ridiculous. You served, right?" He nodded. She gave him antibiotic cream and a bag of socks. That was the last act of kindness he received from a building with a flag on it. The months blurred. He moved from couch to couch, then shelter to shelter. Each move stripped away another layer. By the end of the year, he no longer recognized his own handwriting. One night, after being turned away from a crowded shelter, he sat on a park bench under yellow sodium light. The wind bit through his coat, now more patch than fabric. He took out his dog tags, ran his fingers over the etched letters. Mercer, W/APOS/Catholic/USMC. He tucked them back inside his shirt and muttered, "Some battles end with medals. Others end with silence." That night, the silence won. But he was still breathing. Still walking. And the winter hadn't finished with him yet. He hadn't vanished. He'd simply become invisible. Walter Mercer lived now under a plastic canopy stitched together from garbage bags, duct tape, and a ripped American flag someone had thrown away after the 4th of July. It flapped in the wind above his head, more like a cruel joke than a symbol of pride. His tent sat behind a half-demolished warehouse on the edge of town, shielded from wind by broken pallets and forgotten crates. Each morning began the same, a cough that wouldn't go, the crack of frozen joints, and a slow shuffle toward the convenience store dumpster. If he was lucky, the pastries were only a day old and still in the wrapper. If not, he settled for cold crackers or a bruised apple. He always shared half of what he found with the stray dog that visited him twice a week. No collar. Just brown eyes and an instinct for quiet men. He no longer counted the days. They passed like smoke. At first, he had marked time by Sundays, church bells in the distance, but then the bells were replaced by silence, or maybe he'd just stopped listening. Winter muffled everything. His body was changing. Shoulders once squared from years in uniform now stooped under the weight of damp clothes and sleepless nights. His hands, once trained to hold rifles, write field reports, or steady a frightened recruit's shoulder, now trembled from hunger and cold. His boots had long given up the fight. The soles flapped with every step. Sometimes, people passed him on the street. They walked faster when they saw him. He could see it in their faces, the flicker of discomfort, the quick shift of the eyes, the pursed lips pretending not to notice. Some crossed the street altogether. Once, a child pointed and asked, "Mom, is he sick?" The mother didn't answer. Just pulled her daughter's hand and hurried away. Not all were unkind. A teenage boy once offered him a sandwich and called him "sir" without irony. An older man gave him a pair of gloves and whispered, "You used to be somebody." Walt only nodded. He still was somebody. The world had just stopped remembering. One day, he made his way to a job site, temp work posted on a bulletin board. When he arrived, the supervisor squinted at his worn ID and said, "You're too old." Liability. No anger. Just dismissal. Walt walked away before anyone could see his hands shaking. He tried writing letters once. A shelter had a small donation box of pens and lined paper. He wrote to the Department of Veterans Affairs. To a congressman. To the base he served out of 20 years ago. He even wrote to Ray Hollis's widow, though he never mailed that one. The paper stayed folded in his coat pocket, worn thin and smudged by weeks of rubbing against his chest. It began with, "Ray would have known what to do." Nights were hardest. The cold pressed into his bones like shrapnel. He layered shirts, newspapers, anything he could find. The sound of sirens echoed through the alleyways, but no one came for him. Not anymore. And still, he carried that same brown envelope. The one with his discharge papers, his service record, the faded photo of his unit in the snow, their arms slung around each other, faces half frozen but smiling. The envelope was sealed in a gallon-size plastic bag, taped shut to keep the water out. His identity was in that bag. The world didn't seem to care, but he did. Because memory mattered. Because truth doesn't disappear just because no one looks for it. Because he had survived things colder than this. Still, there were mornings he looked up at the leaden sky and whispered, "You win." Not to anyone in particular. Maybe to God. Maybe to the winter. But every time, without fail, he got back up. He may have been invisible. But he was still standing. And that had to count for something. The cold that morning was the kind that cracked lips open and made lungs sting. Walt hadn't eaten in almost 2 days. His fingers were so stiff he couldn't tie the rope holding his tarp down. A wind gust knocked the whole thing sideways, tearing one garbage bag loose. He didn't bother fixing it. Not today. His stomach growled with a deep, twisting ache. He tried drinking water to calm it, but it only made him shiver worse. He stared at the 2 crumpled dollars in his hand, what was left from collecting cans, and the 3 coins in his pocket. Not enough. Not even close. The grocery store on Maple had heating vents near the sidewalk. Sometimes, he stood over them to warm his boots, pretending to read the store's flyers taped to the window. That morning, he pressed his hand to the glass. Inside, shelves full of bread, fruit, fresh cheese. Things he hadn't tasted in months. He stepped in, hood low over his brow. He didn't smell right, he knew that. His coat carried weeks of damp and smoke from the trash fires he huddled near at night. Eyes followed him as soon as he crossed the security scanner. He kept his head down. Moved slow. 1 loaf of white bread. 1 wedge of cheese in a paper wrapper. He held them gently, like they might break. He reached into his pocket, pretending to search for money. Then, heart thudding in his chest, he slipped both items under his coat and walked toward the door. The alarm didn't go off. but the store manager saw. A short man with too much cologne and a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. "Hey," he shouted, striding after Walt. "Put it back, old man. Don't make this harder." Walt didn't run. He just stopped, turned slowly, and removed the bread and cheese from under his coat. "I wasn't stealing," he said, his voice dry as ash. "I was surviving." The manager didn't care. Neither did the officer who arrived 10 minutes later. The cuffs were cold, and they clicked shut around his wrists like punctuation marks in a story no one wanted to read. "Name?" the officer asked without looking up from his notepad. "Walter Mercer." There was a pause. The younger of the two officers glanced up, narrowing his eyes. "Mercer. You a vet?" Walt nodded. The dog tags around his neck clinked softly as he shifted. The younger cop noticed, leaned closer. "USMC?" he asked. Walt nodded again. "Staff Sergeant. Honorably discharged. 2nd Battalion." For a second, the officer's jaw tightened. Then he looked away, clearing his throat. "Still have to process you, sir." "I'm sorry." Walt didn't argue. He understood the chain of command. He'd lived by it. They took him to the precinct, sat him on a bench under flickering fluorescent lights. He held his envelope to his chest the entire time. They let him keep it after searching it, found nothing but papers, medals, and a photograph of young men in snow-covered gear. The photo was cracked across the middle, right through his own face. Later that night, in the holding cell, Walt unwrapped the bread and cheese. Someone had saved them. The younger cop, probably. It wasn't much. But it was warm. And it tasted like something close to dignity. He ate every bite slowly. Outside, the snow had started again. He could see it falling through the bars of the narrow window above him. Each flake a reminder that winter wasn't done with him yet. But neither was the fight. The courtroom was small. Pale walls, flickering lights, scuffed floors. No grandeur here, just the kind of place where the broken ended up, filtered through the system like dust through vents. Walter Mercer sat quietly at the defendant's table, wearing the same coat he'd been arrested in. He hadn't spoken much since they brought him in, save for his name and, "not guilty." His fingers fidgeted with the edge of the plastic bag containing his documents. His dog tags hung outside his shirt now, he didn't care who saw. The public defender assigned to him, a woman in her 30s named Diane Kim, had tried to get him to talk more. But Walt only nodded or gave single-syllable answers. "You served?" she'd asked. He handed her the envelope. She opened it slowly, scanning the contents, then looked up at him. Her mouth opened to say something, but she paused. "Let's see how this goes," she finally whispered. The courtroom buzzed with low conversation and the squeak of boots on tile. Two officers stood near the door. The prosecutor flipped through files, not even looking in Walt's direction. Then the judge walked in. Gray-bearded, thick glasses, black robe over a faded blue sweater. He carried a thermos and a manila folder under his arm. "Court is now in session," the bailiff called. The judge sat, adjusting his glasses. "State versus Walter Mercer. Misdemeanor petty theft, first offense. No priors." He skimmed the file, then looked up. "Mr. Mercer, you have a public defender. Do you understand the charges?" Walt stood slowly, his knees stiff. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge blinked. His eyes narrowed, lips parting slightly. "Walter Mercer." "Yes, sir." There was a beat of silence. Then the judge said, quietly, "What unit?" Walt didn't answer immediately. Then, 2nd Battalion, Echo Company. Afghanistan. Winter deployment, 2002. The courtroom fell silent. The prosecutor looked up for the first time. The judge leaned forward slowly, his voice suddenly raw. "You pulled a captain out of a minefield. Under fire." Walt tilted his head. His voice was hoarse. "Captain Hollis. Ray." The judge removed his glasses. "Ray Hollis was my brother-in-law." Walt blinked, slowly. The judge rose from the bench. "He talked about you. Said you stayed behind when others ran." You were the reason he came home. Walt said nothing. His hands trembled now, slightly. He reached into the plastic bag and slowly pulled out his Bronze Star citation, folded in thirds. Then the photo. Then the dog tags. Diane, his defender, placed the documents on the table. Your Honor, my client has been denied VA benefits for over a decade due to paperwork errors and misfiled records. He's attempted to contact multiple agencies. He's never received proper assistance. The judge didn't sit. He turned to the bailiff. Bring me the defendant's file. Now. The prosecutor stood. Your Honor, we weren't aware. I don't care what you were aware of, the judge snapped. The bailiff returned with the manila file. The judge opened it. Inside, a rap sheet with one line. A photo of the stolen bread and cheese. And a fingerprint sheet. The judge looked up at Walt. Do you still have your discharge papers? Walt held them out with both hands. Sir, they're all there. Medical files are missing, but the rest. The judge waved him off. Staff Sergeant Mercer, he said, voice steady now, you are not invisible here. Walt sat down heavily. His eyes were glassy, but no tears fell. The courtroom remained frozen in place, no one moved, no one whispered. Then the judge spoke again, softer. Dismissed. With prejudice. I'll be forwarding this case directly to the regional VA office myself. You'll be contacted within 72 hours. Diane exhaled slowly. Walt's grip on the envelope loosened. The younger officer from the arrest, standing in the back, gave a quiet nod. Not one of pity, one of recognition. And as Walt stood to leave, someone in the gallery stood too. Then another. No clapping. No noise. Just people rising to their feet, one by one, in silent acknowledgement. A courtroom salute. Walter didn't speak much on the ride back from court. Diane drove him herself, said it was easier than waiting for paperwork to catch up. He sat in the passenger seat, envelope pressed to his chest, the seatbelt clicking against his dog tags with every bump in the road. The VA office called the next day. They said the judge's referral had triggered a formal review. That someone from Washington had, personally flagged, his case. That a benefits liaison would meet him in person at the shelter where Diane had helped him find a bed. The shelter wasn't much, just a cot behind a locked door, but it had heat, running water, and a clean towel. For the first time in weeks, he slept through the night. The next morning, the liaison showed up. Young guy. Maybe 28. Hair too neat, tie too tight. He introduced himself as Mark and shook Walt's hand like he knew he shouldn't squeeze too hard. Sir, I'm here to make this right. Walt didn't answer. He just slid the envelope across the table. Mark opened it carefully, like it was a sacred object. I've seen these before, he said, running his fingers over the Bronze Star citation. My grandfather had one. You shouldn't have fallen through the cracks. Walt gave a tired laugh. Cracks turned into canyons. Mark looked up, eyes steady. We're filling them now. Paperwork came quickly this time. Faster than Walt had thought possible. His records were reinstated in full, they said. Back pay was approved. Medical coverage restored. They asked where he'd like his first pension payment deposited. He didn't have a bank account. So Diane helped him open one. Then she drove him to a walk-in clinic where his feet were treated, his teeth x-rayed, and his cough finally diagnosed as bronchitis. They gave him antibiotics and 2 clean pairs of thermal socks. The story had already hit the local papers. Veteran arrested for bread theft turns out to be war hero, was the headline. A photo of him in court, dog tags glinting in courtroom light, circulated online. He hated the attention, but he didn't stop it. Not this time. A week later, he received a letter. Handwritten. From a woman named Linda Hollis, Ray's sister, the judge's wife. You kept your promise to my brother. You brought him home. We never forgot you. I'm sorry the world did. There was a return address. Walt placed it on the nightstand beside his cot. The second court hearing was procedural, just a check-in to confirm the dismissal. But the room was full again. Not journalists. Not lawyers. Veterans. Dozens of them. Some in old uniforms. Some in wheelchairs. Some holding flags, medals, photos. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. The judge simply said, "Good to see you again, Sergeant," and nodded. Walt nodded back. Afterward, one of the veterans stepped forward. An older man with missing fingers and eyes like broken glass. He handed Walt a small coin, a challenge coin, from the same unit Walt had served with. "We heard about you," the man said. "You're still one of us." Walt closed his hand around the coin. No applause. No ceremony. Just quiet acknowledgement. It was enough. As Diane drove him back to the shelter, the city looked different somehow. Not warmer. But clearer. Like a fog had finally lifted. She glanced over at him and said, "You know, we can try to get you into veteran housing. A real place." He nodded. "Maybe." Then, after a pause, he looked out the window and whispered, "Even the coldest winters end. And this one's over." The new apartment wasn't much, one room, a kitchenette, a window facing a row of trees, but it was his. The key felt strange in his hand the first time he turned it. Too light for something that opened a door to peace. The walls were bare. The mattress firm. There was no television, no clock ticking on the wall. Just quiet. Walt unpacked his envelope first. He placed the dog tags gently on the nightstand. Laid out the bronze star on the dresser, next to the challenge coin the veteran had given him in court. At the foot of his bed, he folded his old service jacket with care and slid it into the drawer, buttoned and smoothed. For the first time in years, it wouldn't serve as a blanket. A photo went on the wall, Ray Hollis, grinning under snow, his arm around Walt's shoulder. It had been reprinted and framed, sent by Linda along with a short note and an invitation to visit when he was ready. The apartment came with a radio, one of those cheap portable ones with plastic knobs. He turned it on, tuned it to static, then finally found a station playing soft jazz. He let it play, filling the silence with something warmer than memory. The next morning, there was a knock on the door. Walt opened it to find a young volunteer from a local animal rescue center, holding the leash of a medium-sized mutt with scruffy fur and calm, amber eyes. "We heard about you," she said, handing him a folder. "They said you used to feed a stray behind the store. We thought maybe you'd want one of your own." Walt knelt, letting the dog sniff his hand. No hesitation, just a gentle lean into his palm. Acceptance. A bond, wordless and complete. He named the dog Charlie. They took long walks together. Slow ones. Charlie would trot a few paces ahead and then pause, waiting. Walt started talking to him more each day, about the weather, the past, the odd little things that used to make him laugh. Charlie never interrupted. One afternoon, as spring crept in, Walt sat on a wooden bench under a cherry tree just beginning to bloom. The wind smelled less like cold now and more like new things. He closed his eyes, letting sunlight trace the lines on his face. In his hand was the letter he'd never sent, to Ray's widow. He read it aloud to Charlie. "Ray would have known what to do. But I think I figured it out. I'm still here. Not lost. Just slow coming back. They remembered me in the end. Maybe not the world, but enough of it to matter." Charlie leaned his head against Walt's leg. Walt looked down, smiled. He didn't need a parade. Didn't need more medals. He just needed a place, and someone to notice he was still breathing. As the petals began to fall around him, he whispered into the wind. "I found my way back. Just like you promised."